Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Úrsula Dato turned 67 when they first met. An elderly woman had already thrown a bag of garbage into a plastic container when she heard something squeaking inside the container. She looked inside and noticed that there was a second bag next to hers, exactly the same, and it was moving slightly. The squeak was coming from there. Úrsula Dato reached the bag with difficulty, pulled it out, put it on the ground, untied the knot, and she could not believe her eyes. There was a tiny red puppy in the bag. His fur was clumped together, and tears were streaming down the sides of his blue eyes. He looked at the woman with hope and at the same time with fright, tried to stand on his feet, but failed. Apparently, he was too weak to do so. "Who did this to you, darling?" Úrsula Dato said almost in a whisper, "Come here." And she carefully took him in her arms and, straightening up, pressed him to her chest. The puppy licked her hand. What kind of monster could do such a thing? The woman continued to be indignant. "Bastards." Úrsula Dato stood like that for another 5 minutes, trying to figure out what to do with this poor dog. She was old, and she was getting more and more weak every year, even every month. How long would she stay in this world? 5 years at the most. And if she adopts the puppy now, then, when she is gone, who will take care of the dog? The village where Úrsula Dato had lived all her life was dying out, and more inhabitants were moving into the city. Only 3 old-timers remained: Úrsula, the former teacher Casilda Morales across the street, and the old man Adon. But he was almost 80. He hadn't recognized almost anyone for a couple of years, but only sat on a bench from dawn to dusk and smoked stinky cigarettes. Most of his acquaintances had gone to heaven or moved to the city to live with their children, and the young people who had rebuilt houses for summer homes were different. Many of them came with their expensive angry dogs, and they didn't like the local abandoned and stray dogs, and often called the service for catching stray animals. The workers of this service were cruel, so it was scary to even think about what happened to the dogs that they managed to catch. If Úrsula dies, they will put this poor Pellerojo in a cage and take him away to some unknown place. Suddenly she realized that she had already given him a name. Pellerojo. She was responsible for him now, no matter what. She just couldn't put it back in the bag. And there was hardly anyone in the village willing to take him in. The snow was beginning to melt outside. It was the end of March, the roads were slick, and the vegetable garden and barbecue season was still a long time away. There's hardly anyone in the entire neighborhood. "Well, Pellerojo," the woman summed up her thoughts aloud, "we'll survive somehow. God will help us." And Úrsula Dato hurried home, holding Pellerojo in her arms. At home, she fed the puppy with what she could find, poured some milk, and put some bread in it. He ate greedily, warmed up, regained his strength, and began to stand on his feet and wag his tail a little. Úrsula prepared more food, heated water, bathed the puppy, wrapped him in a thick towel, and lay down on the bed with him. The woman was tired because of the worries and all the fuss. She woke up an hour later, and the first thing she saw before her eyes was Pellerojo's smiling face. He was looking at her just like a human, sticking his face and front paws out of the towel. "Well, are you warmed up?" Úrsula Dato smiled back at him. "Let's go and find you a place to sleep." And the woman started fussing around again. She even felt more energized, and her mind became more clear. Now she had someone to take care of, something to plan for the days ahead. During the last 2 years, her evenings were similar to each other, and not only did Úrsula begin to mix up the days of the week, but sometimes she did not immediately remember what month it was. 2 years ago, her closest friend had died, and then her son and daughter, who now lived in the south by the sea, put an ultimatum to her: she has to finally move in with them, otherwise, they don't promise to visit her in the village even once a year. "We have a lot of work, we can't come visit you," they said. Her daughter gave birth to her 3rd child, while the 2 older ones had already entered university. And her son had recently divorced and was in a legal battle with his second ex-wife trying to get permission to raise their child. Needless to say, Úrsula didn't want to leave the village. She was born here, Here she spent her hungry childhood during the war years. Here, together with her mother, she waited for several years for the return of her father who was missing at the battlefront. But he never came back. Her mother, realizing that her husband would never come back, quickly got sick and died, leaving the 16-year-old Ursula alone to struggle with the difficult post-war life. She had to drop out of school, work as a milkmaid, and run the farm. And she withstood it. Many of her friends left the village to go to college, and none of them came back. They persuaded her to leave too. Spinners and weavers were in demand everywhere. One day Ursula met a city man who happened to be in the village by chance. He almost talked her into working at his factory in the city, promising to help her with everything when she arrived. But a month after his departure, the girl realized that she was pregnant. She wrote letters to this man, asking him about what to do now, but he never replied. And now 18-year-old Ursula had also to raise her son all alone, without any help. Back then, the reputation of a single mother was a disgrace, and the girl realized that she would hardly find a life partner. She had almost given up hope of finding her soulmate when a young agronomist, Benito, showed up in the village. She fell in love with him at first sight. She had never felt such feelings for a man before. And, strangely enough, Benito responded to her feelings. This time everything was real, without lies or betrayals. A year later they got married and soon Roquelia was born. It seemed that there was no end to their happiness, everything was perfect. Ursula even managed to enter the agricultural college part-time, hoping to build a career in the future. The neighbors also began to treat her with respect, completely forgetting about the past. But everything came to an end as quickly as it had begun. Benito died of a heart attack while he was sleeping. Ursula could not understand how she had the strength to start everything from scratch again. She had to drop out of college, just as she had once dropped out of school. Working 2 jobs and barely having time to help her children with their studies, she still managed to cope with everything, provided her son and daughter with secondary education and, when they grew up, sent one after another to the city to get a university education so that they could get a chance to achieve what their mother had failed to achieve. And they succeeded. Her son was the first to marry, and then her daughter found a good husband. Every year they came to visit her during the summer. Her son repaired the old shabby house, and her daughter loved to walk in the forest with her children, picking berries and mushrooms, and then making jam, the aroma of which spread throughout the village. But 2 years ago they stopped coming, and Ursula was determined to stay in the village for the rest of her life. But after the death of her friend, longing became a constant guest in her house. Every month it became worse, taking the last of her strength. It became difficult to get to the store and carry heavy bags of groceries. It even made her lose her appetite. Thinking about having to go to the store again and carrying heavy bags, she just couldn't eat anything. However, when Pelorojo came into her life, everything suddenly changed. Well, not overnight, and not even in 1 week, but gradually. And so Ursula's new life began. She was happy, though she did not stop worrying about the dog's fate. After all, she was old, and she had no idea what would happen when she passed away. The dog grew up and became nice, healthy, with a long, shiny fur and with the kindest character. It even turned out that he was not just a simple dog, he was a Sheltie. At least, that's what the owners of other dogs who started coming to the village occasionally said. And she never found out who put the puppy in the trash 5 years ago. 5 years flew by like one day. Ursula's neighbors scolded her, saying, "Why did you put such a burden on your old shoulders?" At first, she tried to justify herself by telling that she had found Pelorojo in a garbage dump, thinking they would understand why she did it. "You should have left this dog there," the neighbors reproached her. "Why do you even have to save some dogs? Your pension isn't even enough for you, and now you have to feed this huge beast." Pelorojo understood everything. Ursula knew for sure that the dog understood everything like a human, so she didn't have such conversations with the neighbors anymore. In fact, he wasn't that big and didn't eat that much, it was just the thick fur that made the dog look huge. When Ursula bathed him, he became really tiny. But he liked to walk a lot. In the fall, they went mushrooming together. Ursula could not distinguish a mushroom among the mottled fallen leaves anymore due to her poor eyesight. So Pellerojo assisted her. He could find good mushrooms by sniffing and called Ursula by barking. Úrsula Dato loved such hikes. But one day on one of such walks she suddenly felt unwell, her heart ached. She had heart problems before, but she had never felt this bad before. The woman sat down on a stump to have some rest, but she could not get up again, she lost consciousness. Pellerojo ran around her for a minute, whining, barking, and licking her pale face with his rough tongue. Then realizing that his mistress would not be able to come to her senses on her own, he rushed into the village, attracting the attention of everyone he met with his loud barks. Strangely enough, the first to react was Adon, who, despite his old age, was still on duty on the bench outside his house. He dropped his cigarette, went to his neighbor, and asked him to go after Pellerojo and check if something had happened to Ursula in the forest. The neighbor reluctantly agreed and got there just in time. He brought Ursula home and called an ambulance. Fortunately, the rains were not so frequent in September, so the ambulance reached the village quickly and took the elderly woman to the hospital in the nearest city. And for the first time in 5 years of his dog's life, Pellerojo was left alone. The first night he guarded the house as a loyal and responsible dog should. Of course, he didn't sense everything like a human guardian. It was more like a state of anxiety, as if something was approaching the house. After all, it was his home too, and he wanted to protect that home. Unfortunately, the temperature had dropped a lot during the night. The stars shone brightly in the sky, and the huge moon of an unnatural color, which seemed to Pellerojo gloomy gray, floated above the tops of the spruce trees. And he had an unbearable urge to howl. He thought of his helpless mistress when they had dragged her on a stretcher into the iron box on wheels, and a longing seized his little dog's heart. He couldn't help it, and whimpered loudly, turning to a howl. His song was immediately echoed by the other dogs who were still in the village with their owners. People in neighboring houses began to turn on their lights and scold the dogs. Pellerojo fell silent. No, howling and complaining won't help, he has to do something else. Nothing will probably happen to the house anytime soon. The first thing to do was to find Ursula and listen to what she would say if she regained consciousness. Pellerojo went through hundreds of smells in his mind, focusing on one of them. It was the smell of that iron box, unique, unlike anything else. It was the smell of all the cars that came into the village, and then. Also, it was the smell of the little white circles that Ursula took every day with water. In addition to this bouquet, there was something similar to the smell of Adon when he was drunk. It was a unique combination that could not be mixed up with anything else. Pellerojo ran out onto the road and, finding the trail of the ambulance, ran with his nose bowed low to the ground. The remaining scent mixed with the scent of asphalt, dirt, and pine tar was enough to keep him on the right track. The sun had not yet risen above the horizon when he came to the emergency ward building of the first city hospital. All traces were lost here. He must get inside to continue the search. People would occasionally come out of the building, looking at Pellerojo, nodding their heads, or smiling. Someone even tried to pet him. It made Pellerojo a little tense, but he allowed it. When the door was left open for a couple of seconds, it was enough for him to detect the scent of his mistress. She was definitely there, in the depths of a gloomy gray building. Well, the building wasn't gray, it was dark red, but Pellerojo, like all the dogs, didn't see the difference between red and gray. A young girl in a white uniform came out of the hospital in the afternoon. The dog smelled Ursula's scent on this girl especially clearly. Pellerojo even stood up and wagged his tail, looking at the stranger questioningly. "Doggy," the girl said, smiling, "what a cute boy. Who are you waiting for? Are you here to see someone in this ward?" The girl bent down and held out her hand to him. Her hand smelled of medicine and strawberry soap. They had the same soap at home. Pellerojo licked the warm palm. "Poor baby," the nurse continued to speak to him. "I'll ask in the wards whose dog could come here. Actually, yesterday an ambulance delivered an old lady, Ursula." Pellerojo barked after hearing the familiar name. The girl shuddered slightly and pulled her hand away. The dog whined, for he didn't mean to frighten the girl. To calm the stranger, Pellerojo stood up again, wagged his tail, and began to bounce with his front paws. The girl smiled again, understanding him correctly this time. "So, Ursula?" She repeated the name. Pellerojo barked again. "Okay, buddy, I got it. I'll ask her when I get back. She came to her senses, so don't worry. But to be honest, your owner is still very weak, and anyway, we can only wait and pray to the Almighty." Pellerojo didn't know many words and didn't understand all the details of what he heard. He only knew 3 words: Ursula, good, and Almighty. But this was enough for him to conclude that this girl knew Ursula quite well, that Ursula was now conscious, and that some circumstances prevented him from certainty. In the past, Ursula had always mentioned Almighty when she felt anxious. The girl walked away. Pellerojo moved closer to the door and lay down. He would stay here for as long as necessary. Though, he continued to worry about the house as well. The dog realized he couldn't leave this place now, but he knew he had to somehow be near the hospital and at the same time keep the house safe. The nurse's name was Romina. She had only been working at the hospital for 2 months. She was very young, just graduated from university. She was a kind and romantic girl. The gray and gloomy hospital's everyday life didn't change her perception of her chosen profession yet. At first, she thought everything would be fine once she gained experience at the hospital. But from the first month of her work there, everything went wrong. It turned out that the hospital was short of many medicines and that doctors were constantly quitting after working for a while and gaining experience. They transferred to private hospitals. All the staff had to work overtime, but the salaries were still miserable. There was a catastrophic shortage of junior and middle staff. Many orderlies often drank alcohol at work and often took money from patients for the most basic services they were supposed to provide anyway. Romina didn't understand why they did it, because it was inhuman. But she knew for sure that she would never be like that. The Hippocratic Oath and medical ethics were not just empty words for Romina. When she returned from the therapeutic unit to the surgery unit, she went straight to Úrsula Dato's room, just as she had promised Pellerojo, who continued to lie near the entrance. Ursula had lost a lot of weight in just 24 hours. Her pale face had dozens of new wrinkles, her eyes turned colorless, and looked with longing and despair. Úrsula Dato, Romina turned to her and put her hand on Ursula's arm. "There's a red-haired dog waiting for someone at the entrance all day. Isn't it yours by any chance?" Ursula perked up. A lively light flashed in her eyes for a second, and even her cheeks had a slight blush. "A dog? Did he really come here? A fluffy red dog? He has such a breed. I forget this word all the time. It starts with the SH. Sheltie?" Romina told her. "Yes, Sheltie. I think that's really my dog. What a clever boy. He found me. His name is Pellerojo. I don't know how he'll survive without me if God takes me away." "Don't say that, Úrsula Dato. You are a fighter, and you will definitely win this battle with the disease. I'm sick of fighting for my life. I feel I don't have much time left. Honey, could you bring Pellerojo here at least for a moment? I'd say goodbye to him and give him some guidance, or it would be a shame if I left without saying goodbye to my only friend." Romina realized that there was no point in arguing with Ursula now, and her condition was really critical. Her heart was barely functioning. All the tests were taken and the results said that it was impossible to perform the surgery. Her weak body would not survive. The only thing left was to hope for a miracle. But Romina couldn't say anything comforting. Animals are strictly forbidden in the hospital. She said, "The only thing I can do is bring your dog here at night while everyone is asleep. I'll stay for the night shift tonight. If Pellerojo is still here, I'll try to bring him to you. But I can't promise, you know. Okay?" "All right, darling," Ursula nodded. "I understand. I don't want you to get in trouble because of me. But Pellerojo and I are family, and he has no one else but me. If it wasn't for him, I would have died a long time ago. He gave me the meaning of life and gave me strength. I'm sorry I can't repay you for your kindness, Romina. I'm very grateful to you. Come on, Úrsula Dato, Romina interrupted her. I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do, helping people. Okay, you need to get some rest now. I'll come back in an hour to give you an injection. Úrsula didn't say anything but closed her eyes and a tear rolled down her cheek. In the evening, Romina bought some dog food and a small bowl at the nearest store. She poured water into the bowl and put the food on the grass near the entrance. Pellerojo drank some water but didn't eat at all. He tucked his tail, as if apologizing to the girl for his lack of appetite, and curled up again by the door. Romina said something to him. From the familiar words and her tone, Pellerojo realized that she had kept her promise and that now he had a chance to get inside the hospital. But when? He didn't know that. He couldn't stop thinking about the fact that no one was guarding the house, but he couldn't move away from the hospital now. Unpleasant feelings began to squeeze his heart. At first it was like the little droplets that fell from icicles in the spring, but soon it was turning into streams. The premonitions rang in his head, rattling and shrieking unpleasantly. The heart was beating increasingly faster. By midnight, Pellerojo was seized by panic. He got up and started scratching at the door. Fortunately, the door opened and Romina showed up on the doorstep. "Are you here, Pellerojo?" she said quietly. "What a good boy. Let's go quickly. Come on in." Pellerojo understood what she said. Cautiously, he slipped his nose through the open door and sniffed. His heart pounded even harder. "Be careful, please," Romina said in a whisper. "Don't bark, just follow me quietly." Pellerojo entered and followed the girl, tucking his tail and pinning his ears back. They walked up the wide stairs to the second floor, turning left. There was another girl, also in a white uniform, sitting against the wall in the light of a single lamp. She looked surprised at the couple sneaking in and twisted her finger at her temple, looking questioningly at Romina. But Romina only pressed her index finger to her lips in response. They walked another 10 meters and turned the corner. Finally, Pellerojo smelled the familiar deer scent and forgot about everything else in the world. He almost barked, but came to his senses in time, because now Romina looked at him and put her index finger to her lips again. Pellerojo barely kept himself from barking, wagging his tail excitedly. Romina opened the door of the room and let the dog in. That night Úrsula felt very bad. She began to forget different things from time to time, mixing up names and events in her life. It seemed to her that the war was still going on around. She asked about her father, whether he had sent her any news from the battlefront. Sometimes she spoke to Romina, calling her by her daughter's name. But even in this condition, she had not forgotten about Pellerojo and was waiting for the nurse to bring him to her room. Romina had called Úrsula's son yesterday and told him about his mother's poor condition. He promised to call his sister and come to the hospital as soon as possible. When Pellerojo came to Úrsula's bedside and put his head in her cold hand, she opened her eyes and a smile lit up her face. "Pellerojo," she said, barely audible, "my dear boy, you found me." She wanted to stroke the dog's head, but her hand was no longer obeying her. "I'm sorry I left you alone. But that's what life has decided," she continued, sighing heavily with each word. "But you and I knew it. We always knew it would happen someday. I'm sorry. I guess my time in this world is over." The dog kept his eyes on Úrsula, listening to every word she said. She could barely speak, but Pellerojo didn't need any words. He could hear everything, how hard her heartbeat was, how her chest wheezed, and how slowly the blood flowed through her veins. And the most important smell of Úrsula became barely recognizable. To Pellerojo it was the smell of the sun and the stars in the clear night sky. It was the smell of life. If he knew anything about the soul, he would have thought that this was the smell of the soul. Every person has the same base of this smell, and only slight nuances bring in the peculiarities of a unique personality and some kind of kinship code. The dog could easily identify relatives, friends, and strangers by smell. Another 10 minutes passed in complete silence. Romina stood at the door of the room and cried quietly. The cramped space was barely illuminated by a dim lamp and a street lamp, the light of which, tangled in the foliage of the tall linden trees, showed strange shadows on the wall. There were two other elderly women in the room with Ursula, but they were asleep and couldn't see that strange night scene. Then Ursula closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and fell asleep forever. Pellerojo shuddered, bumped his nose into her palm, then turned around and looked at Romina as if looking for an answer. But she covered her face with her hands and didn't see the dog's questioning gaze. That was it. The scent of the soul had finally left Ursula's body. Romina was afraid that now it would be difficult to get Pellerojo out of the hospital. But when she calmed down a little, she approached him and wanted to say something, but he rushed to the exit, so she caught up with him only at the door of the emergency unit. Romina let him out, and he immediately ran off toward the highway. Pellerojo headed toward his house. Suddenly something told him that he must be there now. Because if Ursula's soul isn't here, she could have gone back to the house. Where else could she have gone? Of course, the dog couldn't make long logical chains. He had a different way of thinking. Ideas and sequences of action flashed through his mind all at once in one piece. And if the ideas looked like they had the right shape, then he could follow them without any doubts. But this last idea turned out to be awkward. Something was breaking its smooth edges all the time, forming some kind of holes. After running along the highway for about a mile, Pellerojo stopped. No, that's not where he should go. Ursula is not at home. Something is trying to trick him, to mislead him. He should go back. This idea looked definitely like the right one. Pellerojo turned around and raced back even faster. He made it just in time. The gurney with the body of the deceased Ursula was already on its way to the nearby morgue. Pellerojo could smell that it was Ursula in the black plastic bag. An orderly was pushing the gurney, and Romina was walking next to him with papers in her hands. Seeing Pellerojo, the girl called out to him. And the dog joined the procession. "Is this the dog you were talking about?" The orderly asked Romina. "Yes. Please don't chase him away if he stays near the morgue." "Okay." As they walked around the rectangular one-story building, Pellerojo remembered that he had been here once before, when he had traveled by bus with a few villagers to pick up the body of Ursula's friend. He remembered those smells too. They were unique. They took people who no longer had the smell of a soul from here and took them to a graveyard a kilometer away from their village. There, they were buried in the ground for some reason. Pellerojo saw it all and realized that no one could return from the graveyard. So he had to wait for Ursula to be put in a wooden box and taken to the graveyard. He didn't understand why people did that. He only knew he had to stay with Ursula until the last minute, until she was gone to an unknown world. For the next 2 days, Romina watched Pellerojo from the window of the staff room. The orderlies and the guard didn't chase him away. Romina brought him food at lunchtime. Pellerojo ate only on the second day, but still without much appetite. On the day of the funeral, a bus arrived at the morgue. 6 people already stood in front of the building. Some were quietly talking to each other, some were silently smoking. Ursula's children had arrived 2 days ago. Pellerojo had never seen them before. It was Romina's day off, and the orderlies didn't even think of explaining to the brother and sister what the red dog had to do with Ursula. Though they must have guessed it, for they knew that Ursula had a dog. But they paid no attention to Pellerojo. Pellerojo recognized Ursula's children by the smell, but didn't approach them. When the open coffin with the body was brought out, Pellerojo finally saw his dear Ursula, only the front part of her face, as his height didn't allow him to see more. Ursula didn't look like herself at all. The coffin was carried into the bus, and 4 people got into the same bus. Pellerojo walked to the door, hoping to be invited in. "Hey! Where are you going?" Ursula's son shouted at him. "Get out of here." "This is Ursula's dog," one of the villagers said. "Let him come with us." But the man said nothing to this. He only shook his fist at the dog and closed the bus door. The bus drove off, and the dog was left there thinking what he should do now. "So, Ginger, no one needs you now?" the orderly said to him. Run, he waved in the direction of the departing bus. Maybe you'll catch up. There's nothing for you to do here now. And Pellerojo ran off. He knew where the village graveyard was. If only he could make it now, if only he had enough strength. At the cemetery, the dog could hardly stand on his feet from fatigue, but he got there in time. 4 men were lowering the coffin with Ursula's body into the pit. Then people threw some earth into the pit and the coffin was buried. People left the cemetery and Pellerojo was left alone. No one needed him now. He had lost a lot of weight in the last few days. His fur had turned from white and red to dull and gray in some places, and it was clumped together on his sides and chest. After resting a little near the newly buried grave, Pellerojo returned to the house. The gate was closed, but he crawled under the fence and looked around. The house seemed different now. It seemed as if the dog had been away not just a few days, but at least a year. The house seemed smaller, gray, cold, and soggy, though it had not rained for almost a week. Pellerojo walked around the vegetable garden, looking for food, which he liked to hide in the garden. His appetite was back now. He found everything he had hidden. After drinking water from the bucket, he felt his strength begin to return. Behind the cherry trees, in the space between the fence and the blackcurrant bushes, Pellerojo had a sort of secret hut. He had built it for himself. He liked to hide there during the day when Ursula was resting in the house. He was about to go there to think everything over when the door over the porch opened, and a loud man's voice sounded. "Is that you again?" The voice was clearly addressing him. "Get the hell out of here." A large stick flew in his direction. Pellerojo tucked his tail and ran away. Everything in this house was different now. This place is no longer his home. He must find something else. And Pellerojo ran back to the graveyard. Where else could he go? The body of his dear human was there. Maybe that was his home now? When Pellerojo reached the cemetery, he lay down on the damp, cold ground over a grave and curled up. Soon he fell asleep. In his dream, he and Ursula were walking in the autumn forest as usual, looking for white and hog mushrooms. He ran deeper into the forest, finding more and more mushrooms. He was overjoyed and wanted to please his human. The dog began to bark, calling Ursula. He thought that Ursula was following him, but suddenly he saw that she was not there. He got frightened and ran back. But now the forest looked different. It was cold, damp, and dark. The sharp branches stabbed his sides painfully, and he was very scared. He ran, trying to escape this dreadful darkness, but he had less and less strength left. Suddenly, tears streamed from his eyes and the dog woke up. It was dark. The stars were shining in the sky, and he was still lying on the same damp hill, his whole body shivering with cold. He had slept for a very long time. Pellerojo got to his feet and shook his body. Clods of dirt flew in all directions. Where should he go now? Or should he stay here and slowly die? It felt as if his nightmare had become a reality, but the dog didn't know how to escape from this frightening, cruel darkness. No, he has to find a way out. He looked up at the sky and saw a blue star fall far away in the direction where the hospital was. His heart tingled, and a vivid image of an idea flashed through his mind. Yes, he knew where to go. And Pellerojo ran to the place where the star had fallen according to his assumptions. The city hospital complex consisted of 5 main buildings, a polyclinic, a surgical department connected to the therapeutic department by a narrow corridor, a morgue, and a maternity ward located on the other side of the railroad line. In this hospital, some people's lives began and others' lives ended. A bright star that came out of the sky pointed Pellerojo to the maternity hospital. Actually, the star didn't point to anything, but the dog made his own conclusions without understanding why. From that moment on, his life was connected with this place. No one in the backyard of the maternity hospital knew Pellerojo. If Romina were here, she would introduce him to all the local staff, including the janitor and the guard. But he didn't see Romina. So the janitor immediately tried to chase the dog away, threatening him with a broom. Pellerojo felt that the janitor was not doing this out of his natural malice, but simply because he was carrying out his job duties. Perhaps he was supposed to keep everything in order here, including keeping stray red dogs out of the territory. Pellerojo barked at strangers when he was guarding the house, not out of anger, but because he thought it was his duty, so he understood why the janitor tried to chase him away. When the janitor began to shout at him, the dog obediently went to the corner of the small park with benches covered with yellow leaves and an old round fountain. Here he could drink some water. The weather was weird. It was September, but by noon the sun was heating the air so much that the thermometers showed plus 33 degrees Celsius. Pellerojo could not remember anything like this during his short life. In the evening, when the temperature dropped, the stoker would come out of his small building. In the warm season, he heated only one boiler, which heated the water in the maternity hospital. It must have been almost impossible to stay inside that building in such heat. The stoker's name was Terso, and unlike the janitor, he was kind to Pellerojo, bringing him something to eat every day, talking about something, stroking his head, and smoking like old villager Adon. He had no teeth at all in his mouth, and therefore Pellerojo could not understand any of the words he uttered. But he still enjoyed listening to Terso. When he came with a cigarette in his hand, the dog would run up to the bench, lie down at the stoker's feet, and look at the central entrance of the maternity ward with a sadness mixed with an incomprehensible hope, as if Ursula would come out from there sooner or later. Of course, he realized that she was buried in the graveyard and there was no chance that she would suddenly appear in this place, where people don't go to another world, but, on the contrary, where they come from another world to start a new life. But in this case, the image of this idea that flashed into his mind was so undeniable and magnificent that there was no reason to doubt it. Pellerojo didn't know why he felt this way, but a timid hope lurked in his heart. And the moment for which Pellerojo had been waiting for nearly a week had finally come. One morning, when the sun had no time to heat the air yet, a green car pulled up in front of the maternity ward and a young man in a suit with a huge bouquet of flowers got out. Waving to someone at the window, he entered the building, and about 20 minutes later he returned, not alone, but with a woman carrying a tiny human baby. Pellerojo could hear the barely audible squeak of the baby. The dog sniffed the air with his nose and his heart raced. He recognized a familiar smell, painfully familiar, barely detectable, but it was definitely the same smell that disappeared from this world 9 days ago. Pellerojo wanted to run as fast as he could to these strangers, wagging his tail and jumping for joy. But he managed to restrain that impulse and approached them slowly and cautiously. The couple with the baby noticed him. "Look who's here," the girl said, carefully turning the baby toward the dog. "A doggy. Look how cute it is." "Hello, cutie." The man smiled, too, but he was still tense. It was understandable. A strange dog approached his family, and he didn't know what to expect from it. Pellerojo wagged his tail and stuck out his tongue. The baby couldn't see him, unable to focus on anything yet, but the dog could see the baby, and now he knew he was not mistaken in his expectations. This was the little human he had been waiting for so long. Now they must not part. The dog must follow this baby everywhere, wherever these kind people take her. "All right, get in the car," the man said to his wife. "Let's go before the heat starts." They got into the car, started the engine, and drove off. Pellerojo followed them. These kind people who had suddenly entered Pellerojo's life were Silvina and Santiago. They had been married for 3 years. They had a modest wedding just after graduating from the veterinary college in the capital. Back in their hometown, they got a loan and opened their own veterinary clinic, and soon it became the most popular clinic in the neighborhood. They managed to repay the loan quite quickly, but there were other problems related to the fact that clients from competitors began to come to their clinic. The competitors apparently didn't like it, and they did everything they could to make Silvina and Santiago's life more difficult. Once they even tried to set the clinic on fire. By coincidence, the bastard who tried to set the clinic on fire was scared off by a police officer returning home after his shift. The situation was getting more and more tense every month. They had to hire people from a professional security agency. Unknown people called them and threatened them. Nerves were on edge. Santiago and Silvina lived in a private house that Silvina had inherited from her grandmother. As Pellerojo learned a little later, they had no pets, except for a flock of pigeons, for which they built a very nice dovecot. In general, the birth of their daughter was a miracle for them. All the doctors claimed that Silvina will never be able to have children. They explained it with some medical terms, and the couple understood that as well, judging by the tests. They began to think about adopting a child. But considering all the pros and cons, they decided to wait another year and a half. They even went to a remote village to some witch doctor hoping that maybe she would help them. But the old lady gave them very vague and florid predictions, saying about some mysterious dog, which will determine whether their dream of having a baby will come true or not. For the first year, they even began to pay special attention to the dogs in their clinic, trying to believe what the witch doctor had told them, but soon they gave up. However, when they had almost accepted their fate, Silvina got pregnant. It came like a thunderclap. They should have been overjoyed, but they were scared. From that day on, all their efforts were focused on not losing the baby. Weekly appointments with doctors, tests, special nutrition, everything was focused on providing Silvina with the best possible conditions and full control. Thankfully, the threats from competitors seemed to have stopped. It seemed that everyone accepted the success of the clinic. Santiago even decided not to have any security guards, leaving only video surveillance and alarms. After Silvina was admitted to the best maternity hospital in the region, Santiago couldn't relax. He visited his wife every day, sat under the windows, and wandered around the park until his wife asked Santiago to stay at home for the last week or go to work. Otherwise, he would drive her crazy by sitting under the windows. Although it was difficult for her husband to do it, he fulfilled Silvina's request. The delivery was successful. A completely healthy, calm, and smiling girl was born. The couple decided to give her a name only when Silvina returned home from the hospital. The girl was named Beatrice. That night, a few hours before the birth began, Silvina was awake and looked up at the sky. When a star suddenly fell to the ground, she had time to make a wish. And as soon as the bright that rapidly crossed the horizon melted, childbirth began. Silvina didn't know that at that very second, Pellerojo was looking at the same star a few kilometers away, thinking of his dead human. The dog didn't know anything about human beliefs, and he didn't know how to make wishes. But that sudden feeling in his soul told him to run toward the maternity hospital without any clear goal in mind, just as he was running after the green car now. Pellerojo reached Silvina and Santiago's house by noon. Tired from running and from the heat, he simply collapsed near the gate in the shade of a small jasmine bush that barely had any leaves on it. He fell asleep for a while. The creaking of the gate opening woke him up. He woke up and jumped to his feet. Oh, my goodness, he heard Santiago's voice right in front of him. What are you doing here? Did you follow us from the maternity hospital? I can't believe it. Silvina. He shouted in the direction of the house. His wife's head peeked out of the open window. Why are you shouting, Santiago? SHH, baby's asleep, she said quietly. Look who's come to visit us, he said almost in a whisper and pointed his finger at Pellerojo. I can't see behind the branches. Who's there? Pellerojo, realizing that they were talking about him, came out from behind the bush to show himself to Silvina. She only covered her mouth with her palm in surprise. Is it the doggy from the maternity hospital? She asked. Yes, Santiago replied with a smile. Wow. The woman said. Listen, let him in our backyard and give him some water. He must be thirsty, it's too hot today. All right, Santiago agreed, opened the gate, and gestured for Pellerojo to come in. The dog wagged his tail, looked into Santiago's eyes again, then looked at Silvina. She waved at him. Cautiously he walked in and turned around. Santiago kept looking at him in surprise. What are you afraid of, buddy? Come in. Don't be afraid of our pigeons, you'll make friends with them. But please don't hurt them. The man went into the house and came out with a large bowl of cold water sparkling in the sunlight. Pellerojo greedily drained the bowl. And no barking here, Santiago said, raising his index finger upward. Beatriz is sleeping, understand? Pellerojo understood everything, that he shouldn't make any noise, and that he was warmly welcomed in this house, couldn't make any mistakes now. He would do everything these kind people said, as long as he could stay close to the little creature who was very close to him now. Meanwhile, the heat wave continued to ruthlessly seize the city. By midday, the temperature had risen to over 38 degrees Celsius. The meteorologists had long ago promised cooler weather, but nature made one surprise after another. The life-saving coolness only lasted until sunrise, but the dew from the withered grass evaporated in a matter of minutes. The streets were deserted, and people tried not to leave their concrete boxes. The sun reflected off the windows of high-rise buildings and could melt the plastic parts of cars if they were left in the wrong place for half an hour. Emergency services didn't stop going to patients who felt unwell due to the heat. Santiago and Silvina had a lot more work to do as well. They worked in shifts at the clinic. Concerned clients came to the clinic every day with their pets, who suffered from chronic illnesses. It was also necessary to make sure that the pigeons didn't overheat in the dovecot and that they always had cold water. Many of them were hatching eggs and stubbornly refused to leave that place, even though it was very hot. Pellerojo was also suffering from the heat. His thick fur only made things worse. It was good that he didn't have to run anywhere. He could only go to the river 50 meters away from the village. Everyone in the neighborhood already knew the red dog. Joyful children were the absolute masters of the beach, despite the burning heat. The children splashed in the water from morning to evening and gladly welcomed the dog into their games. But the dog didn't spend much time at the beach, worried that something might happen while he was away. He would spend no more than 20 minutes there and then quickly run home, to Beatriz and the kind people who sometimes even let him inside the house. Santiago and Silvina had 2 cars. Silvina had a green car, the one her husband had driven to pick her up from the hospital, and Santiago had a dark blue car with a spacious cabin and a powerful engine. It was the hottest day of the summer, and ultimately it would be the most important day in Pellerojo's and Beatriz's lives. The dog's heart had sensed trouble since morning. It was as if notes of impending misfortune came with the smell of burning leaves. After feeding Beatriz in the morning, Silvina went to work as usual. Pellerojo didn't go to the beach today. Something was holding him back, not letting him move. And his premonitions had not deceived him. At midday, a very nervous Santiago came out of the house with Beatriz in his arms. This had never happened before. Early in the morning or late in the evening, Silvina would go out with the stroller to walk with the baby to the river and back. Pellerojo always walked with her at such times, constantly scanning anyone they met along the way for threats. Strangers rarely came there, and it was always safe, but the dog felt it was his duty to protect his family. Pellerojo remembered the day when Úrsula felt unwell in the forest, and what happened afterward. No one would risk taking Beatriz out into the heat, and no one would put the infant in the car. The overheated car was radiating heat as if it was a stove. If Santiago dared to go outside with Beatriz in this heat, something bad must have happened. Pellerojo wanted to jump into the car too, but Santiago gestured to stop. "Wait here, buddy," he said sternly. "Don't worry, everything's fine. I'll be back soon." But the man failed to reassure the dog. Pellerojo knew from the tone of his voice and from the smell that disaster was coming and that there was nothing normal about the situation. As soon as the car moved from the spot, Pellerojo immediately rushed after it. Santiago drove slowly because Beatriz was in the car. He turned on the climate control, but it refused to work when the car got on the highway. Luckily, the air conditioner had time to cool the car down a bit. 10 minutes ago, Silvina called him and told him she got into an accident. A cargo truck hit her car. The driver fainted before he could stop. Her car was badly damaged, and she bruised her ankle. The police arrived quickly, but the paperwork and medical reports would take a long time. Unfortunately, she hadn't locked the clinic door. She had suddenly run out of bandages and had hoped to make a quick trip to the nearest pharmacy. Please stop by the pharmacy on the way, his wife said over the phone, buy 10 packages. There's a dog in the clinic with a wound that needs to be treated and bandaged. But I can't leave Beatrice alone. Confused, Santiago said. Put her in a carrier and drive carefully with her. It is not hot in the clinic, the air conditioner is working. I will sort everything out soon and come to you. Don't worry about me, I'm fine. When Santiago drove up to the pharmacy, it was already quite hot in the car. He had to act quickly. He had to buy everything he needed and get to the clinic in 5 minutes. The city roads were empty. Santiago tried to turn on the climate control one more time, but it didn't work. He slammed his fist on the panel in despair and frightened even himself. Oh, baby, he said quietly to his daughter, I'm sorry, Daddy's a little upset. Beatrice opened her eyes but was calm. Santiago parked 100 meters away from the pharmacy because it was the only place where there was shade from the trees. He got out of the car, turned the corner, and disappeared from the sight of Pellerojo, who had barely caught up with him. Pellerojo didn't follow him but stayed by the car. His eyes were blurry, and he barely had enough oxygen to keep himself on his feet and not fall over. He was terribly thirsty. But despite the fog in his head, the dog sensed that Beatrice was inside the car, and therefore he must stay there and wait for Santiago. Meanwhile, Santiago encountered unexpected problems. There were 2 other customers in the pharmacy who were talking to the disgruntled salesman about something. They looked like criminals. Under different circumstances, Santiago would just go out and look for another pharmacy. Both of them were shirtless, tattooed to the point that the designs made his eyes twinkle. Moreover, judging by their speech, they were drunk or high. Standing behind them, Santiago wanted to wait his turn, but the men continued their conversation without buying anything. Guys, Santiago couldn't stand it, let me buy some bandages quickly. My kid is in the car, I can't leave her for long. One of them slowly turned around, squinted his eyes as if evaluating Santiago, and slowly said in a creaky voice, Don't you dare call us guys, show some respect. You have to wait until we finish our conversation, and he turned away again. Santiago was indignant. Can you be quicker then? He exclaimed, You're not the only one here. Shut the fuck up, said the second of them, not even turning toward Santiago. Mr. Santiago turned to the seller, who also clearly wanted to get rid of these insane visitors, but could not object to them. Could you please give me 10 packages of bandages and 5 vials of peroxide? I'm in a hurry. Are you out of your fucking mind? The first one turned to him again. We have an important purchase too. Wait, as we told you, and don't make a move. The salesman was probably scared because he pulled out a pack of some pills and placed them on the counter in front of the 2 creepy customers. Sweat was rolling down his face. Just leave, he said, you don't have to pay. Finally, it took you a long time to decide. One of the visitors grinned, took the pills from the counter, turned around, and headed for the exit. The others silently followed him, deliberately hitting Santiago with his shoulder. Morons, the salesman said in a half voice when they finally left, and wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. Bandages for you, he said to Santiago. And peroxide, he said. The guy rummaged through the lower shelves, took out everything he needed, and put it in front of Santiago. Santiago put everything in a bag and handed the money to the seller. Keep the change, he added. Thank you. The salesman didn't say anything, but his eyes showed gratitude. Santiago ran out into the street, but as soon as he reached the corner of the pharmacy, one of the guys from the pharmacy suddenly appeared in front of him. A thin blade, more like an awl, gleamed in his hand. He stabbed Santiago 3 times in the stomach and, without saying anything, walked away with his friend. The sharp pain made Santiago's eyes darken. He pulled back against the wall and slowly, trying to press the bleeding wounds with the palm of his hand, settled down on the hot asphalt. The last thought that flashed through his mind was about Beatrice, who had been left in the car. He must get her out of there. He must call for help. Santiago tried to shout, but the words seemed to be stuck in his throat. He couldn't make a single sound, and after a few seconds he lost consciousness. Meanwhile, Pellerojo, forgetting about fatigue and thirst, ran around the car with his tail tucked and didn't know what to do now. Standing with his paws on the hot car, he tried to look into the cabin to check if Beatrice was all right. At first, she was just moving her arms, and then she lost her pacifier and began to squeak softly. What should he do? Pellerojo looked around again but didn't see a single person on the horizon. He must find Santiago and hurry him up. The girl can't stay in the locked hot car any longer. So the dog rushed toward the pharmacy. But there, he saw an even more horrifying sight. Santiago was bleeding sitting on the hot pavement. Pellerojo licked his face, poked him in the shoulder with his nose, and barked in his ear, but Santiago didn't react. Maybe there's someone inside the pharmacy. Pellerojo started bouncing in front of the front door, barking loudly and banging on the glass with his front paws. Fortunately, the salesman came out hearing this noise. He looked at the dog in surprise, then saw Santiago, turned pale, and rushed to the phone to call an ambulance. Thank God, half the job was done. Now he has to somehow get the guy's attention to the car. Pellerojo continued barking. The salesman came out into the street again. He had tampons and bandages in his hands. Covering the wounds on Santiago's stomach, he pressed the tampons with the bandages, trying to stop the blood. Santiago opened his eyes slightly and looked around in confusion. Seeing Pellerojo, he smiled slightly. Then he realized something, grabbed the guy fussing around him by the shoulder, and said quietly, "My daughter is in the car. The dog will show you the way." He pointed his finger in the direction where he'd parked the car 15 minutes ago. "Here are the keys." Pellerojo calmed down a little, realizing that Santiago was alive, and, running a little away, barked again, as if urging the salesman to follow. "Okay," he said, taking the keys from Santiago's hand, and followed the dog. When he reached the car, he looked inside. The baby was no longer moving. The pharmacist opened the door. He felt a wave of hot, stifling air inside. The guy grabbed the carrier and walked briskly back to the pharmacy. It wasn't that hot inside, the air conditioner was working. Wetting a towel with cold water, the guy began to wipe the baby's face. She started moving her arms again and opened her eyes. By that time the ambulance arrived, followed by the police. The paramedics put Santiago and Beatrice into a car and drove away. The police stayed there to talk to the pharmacist, who could guess what had happened when Santiago went outside, although he didn't see anything himself. Luckily, there was a security camera there and the police saw everything on video. Now Pellerojo could calm down and slowly walk toward the hospital. He knew very well where that painfully familiar iron box on wheels was taking people. And he was not mistaken. At the entrance to the emergency ward, where he had spent more than one night, he met Romina. She was happy to see him. "Pellerojo!" the girl exclaimed. "What are you doing here again?" The dog wagged his tail vigorously. He was glad to see Romina too. "You've lost a lot of weight, boy," the girl said, stroking the dog's head. "I guess you're thirsty? I'll bring you some water, wait here." 5 minutes later the nurse came out with a bowl of water. Pellerojo drank some cold water, and his strength began to return. By evening, when the heat had subsided, a green car pulled up to the building, and Silvina got out, limping heavily on her left leg. She already knew from the police officers and the salesman she had met at the police station what role Pellerojo had played in this incident. And Romina, who had finished her shift and was leaving the hospital at that moment, told Silvina about the part of the dog's life story that not many people knew. Everything was okay with little Beatrice. The very next day Silvina took her home. The girl was perfectly healthy. But, as the doctor said, another 20 minutes in the car could lead to the worst. Santiago was discharged a week later. Vital organs were not affected. The police quickly found that drug-addicted criminals who had attacked him. They went to jail for many years. The pharmacist was not even afraid to testify in court, but then left town just in case. After a couple of days, the weather improved. The sky was covered with a dense veil of clouds, and the life-saving rain started, tearing off the last leaves from the trees and carrying them to the river with the help of the wind. Mushrooms began to emerge from the ground. As for Pelorojo, now he was the happiest dog, having found a new home and new kind owners. He became fat and now had his own chair and full freedom of action. Nothing could be done without his participation, especially matters related to Beatrice. He was always by the baby's side, when her parents fed her, when they swaddled her, and when they took her for a walk or to the hospital. He was the only one who knew that this little girl came into his life for a reason. He clearly remembered the night when a star fell from the sky and the most beautiful image of his life flashed in his mind. His life was not divided into two parts. It began when he looked out of the bag and saw Ursula's face, and continued at the maternity ward when he saw Santiago with Beatrice in his arms. His life was complete, but he was the only one who could understand his life. But in fact, there are many things that humans don't understand, but animals do, especially animals as intelligent and loyal as Pelorojo.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.